Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 159. I'm speaking with Terryl Whitlatch about Jar Jar Binks, Star Wars, and her amazing career creating many identifiable creatures and other amazing stuff. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Okay, welcome to episode 159. I'm really excited for this episode and to speak with Terryl. Terryl is an amazing illustrator and creature designer with a really impressive portfolio and amazing credentials. We talk about a lot of really cool stuff. I'm really excited for this episode. I had a great time speaking with Terryl about her whole career so far, and I want to get right into this episode. One thing I wanted to mention before we get into this is if you haven't gotten the Ultimate Demo Reel Guide, get it now. It's not going to be out for too much longer. So this book is being put out for free. I wanted to put out everything that I know over the past 20 years about building an irresistible demo reel and everything to do with that, as well as not only my perspectives, but a lot of other supervisors, hiring managers, HR, and everyone else, their views of people I've worked with on different productions, as well as with the podcast, all of that information and knowledge put together into this book. In addition to that, there's a lot of advanced tactics and other things associated with that about how to get your reel to go viral and other really cool stuff in an advanced masterclass, which is also free that you can download too. So there's additional videos, a free masterclass, the book. All of this is free. It's only available for a little bit longer if you go to alanmckay.com/myreel. So do that now. In addition to that, if you want to get the show notes, all the key insights that Terryl and I discuss, as well as resources and links to everything that we talk about, go to alanmckay.com/159. That being said, let's get into this episode. Awesome. Well, again, thanks for taking the time to chat. And do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Oh, certainly. Well, my name is Terryl Whitlatch, and I'm an artist. I have been fortunate enough to have spent most of my career, actually, I think all of it, either doing real animals as far as artwork goes, real animals or imaginary animals, and prehistoric animals. So there's always been a lot of variety. There's been all kinds of different sorts of shows or projects and things. And so I feel like I've been very, very, very fortunate to be able to do what I love to do.
That's so awesome. Yeah, and as I was saying a minute ago, I'm really jealous because, yeah, you definitely seem to get to work on some pretty amazing creatures and characters, and there's a lot of diversity there as well. So I think it's really cool. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious, like, did you always want to be an artist growing up, or was this something that you kind of discovered later on into your career?
Well, I think it must have been very, very, very early on. I knew that I wanted to be some sort of an artist. Of course, we're talking about the mind of a child. Being about 3 years old or something. That's when my mother said I was starting to draw, because I could physically hold a crayon at that point. But I'd always, ever since I was very, very small, was fascinated by nature and animals. And it was more that I think the fascination with animals that prompted me to draw them rather than, oh, I'm going to be an artist. I drew them because I wanted to get closer to the animal and try to understand it better. I think that is what the key was for me.
That's so cool. And yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that we don't really think about too much, is kind of really not the mechanics, but, everything to do with all these interesting, animals out there and just all the different things that we have in life. And yeah, typically we might do life drawing. We might look at different ways that we can kind of create or draw a character, but not really, what makes them what they are. And yeah, I think that's really cool. And for you, like, how did you get started? How did you, obviously starting to draw them and kind of get that obsession earlier on with it, but how did you kind of realize that this could potentially be a career down the line?
Well, I was very, very interested in them, and very, very interested, obviously, in zoology and both of contemporary species and prehistoric species. My father had been through medical school, and he taught biology and chemistry. He was always into the sciences, and always taking my sister, my mother, myself to zoos and museums like every other weekend. He had also been all over the world because he was also a naval officer, so I had an interesting dad. And then my mother is an artist. She's an illustrator, still is doing illustration. My sister turned out to be a graphic designer, also very talented watercolorist. But my grandfather, my mother's father, had a horse ranch, and so the first furry animal that I ever actually touched, and this is again when I was very, very, very tiny, was a horse. And so horses have always to this day been very special, my favorite animals. But I think because of that combination of science and art, and I just wanted to, I thought I was going to be, I wanted to somehow use art and science together. But at that point, when I was a child, I really didn't know quite how that was going to work. Mm-hmm. But when I was in high school, I was about, maybe just turned 15 years old. One of my teachers told me that in another biology class that there was going to be a special guest, and the special guest was the scientific illustrator from the University of California at UC Berkeley. And he was going to be there to give a talk to the class, and she thought that I would really appreciate that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so I went to his talk, and that nailed it for me. Here was somebody who's actually using art and science together, natural history illustration. I thought, that is what I want to do. Do you work like for National Geographic? Do you work for paleontologists? Maybe even get my work up at the Smithsonian, that sort of thing. And that is what I want to do. And so that is what I set my objective toward at that age, and I never looked back.
That's so cool. And with that special guest, did you continue a relationship with him after that talk, or was it more the spark that, the ignition that ignited your career? But, was there any further communication beyond that point?
Yes, there was. I wrote him a letter and asked him if I could come, because we didn't, my high school wasn't that far away from UC Berkeley. My dad was stationed in Alameda, California, which is where the naval base was, and Berkeley is just up the freeway, basically. And so I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back. And of course, this is the days before the internet, and so I brought my little 15-year-old self and my 15-year-old self, my drawings there, and he mentored me for the rest of my high school career, and really actually through university.
That's so cool.
Yeah, he was very, very gracious. His name was Gene Chrisman, and I'm sure if anybody who's listening that's in the scientific illustration community will know who I'm talking of. And he was very, very kind gentleman, and my goodness, yeah, so that was wonderful.
That's really great. And did you find having that mentor and perhaps other mentors throughout your career really benefited you, and in what ways do you think that was able to aid you in your career? I'm just curious because again, I think that having mentors, when you're fortunate enough to find them, are always just so beneficial and life-changing to a lot of us.
I think that it was very, very important, instrumental, because again, I was quite young, and there weren't really, honestly, back then in the late 70s and early 80s, there just wasn't as many opportunities for women back then. You were either going to sort of be a secretary or you're going to be a nurse, or you're going to be a teacher. Kind of thought was still kind of going on back then, and I didn't want to do any of that. So that to have someone like that who was in the industry and working and do what I wanted to do, that was just so encouraging. Encouragement goes a long way that not only the spark, but the encouragement that continues to feed the spark is just so very, very lovely and so very, very important.
That's cool. That's really great. And I guess from there, from 15 years old, like between then and going to start working I guess you're kind of tied to a lot of different industries rather than just one specifically. But for you, like what were the kind of like instrumental parts, like the areas that influenced you, or the path that you kind of took from 15 onto landing your first job?
Well, from about age 15, as I seriously with a vengeance started learning as much as I could about animal anatomy as possible, just to get further insights in how they moved, why they looked the way they did, why they behaved the way they did, what it was both the psychology and even the spirituality of animals, and to try to become as sensitive to them as possible. And of course, at this very same time, I was doing a lot of horseback riding and taking lots of lessons there. So with horses, they are an amazingly psychic animal, so that they almost make it easy in a way, because you get so fine-tuned to the horse, and I still ride to this day, and so but just really learning as much as I could about their anatomy, not just horses, but all kinds of, at least especially backboned animals, and how would I apply that to, say, a paleo illustration? How would I apply that to, say, an illustration I might want to do for National Geographic? So I was thinking not just the study of the animals, but how would I portray them in a scene? How would it communicate to an audience? I was thinking primarily the scientific audience, but really what you're doing, whether it's when you're doing any kind of an illustration, it's a story.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you compose a picture? How do you do color? How do you light it? So all the things that you learn in doing filmmaking, basically, I was concentrating on from a very early age, intending to become a biological or zoological illustrator. And the influences that I looked up to were artists like Bob Kuhn, just a wonderful animal illustrator and painter, just the motion and a spot-on anatomy he was able to do. Jay Maternus, who did the wonderful murals of Cenozoic mammals in the Smithsonian Institution. And then there was a wonderful artist named William D. Barry, who did a lot of field guide illustration, and particularly animals of California and of Alaska. They were just so lovely. And you could see with all three of these gentlemen that they felt the animal, they sympathized with it. It was more than just an academic exercise. It was to get into the animal's actual world. And I wanted so badly to be able to do that too.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I love it. And I love the fact that you kind of had that spark lit very early on, and you're able to kind of, use that passion to really kind of pursue something with that clarity. Because I think that a lot of people, especially around 50, are still kind of tossing up what exactly they want to do or who they want to be. And I think that the people who kind of have that narrow focus of like, I've found it and now I can obsess about it, it allows you just to kind of block out the noise and really go after it. So I think that's amazing. And in terms of, I guess, like film or games or anything more in the creative space, like what was the first job that you or project that you landed from there? Like when was that around? I'm just kind of curious when we start getting more into that genre.
Into the entertainment industry?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's see. I had, I'll back up just a little bit to give a little bit of context. So most of my education was in vertebrate zoology and in the sciences. And then after that, about 2 semesters of art school at 2 different schools, maybe a semester, two and a half semesters, around there. And one was at the California College of Arts and Crafts, Oakland, California. Then the other one was right across the bay. That was what was then known as the Academy of Art College. Now it's the Academy of Art University, and it's
right.
grown. But anyway, to get a bachelor's of fine arts from that particular school with an emphasis in illustration, I had to participate. Well, all the graduating students had to participate in a student show. during the last semester. And so I did. And the next day I got a call from Lucasfilm.
Could have worked out well.
Yeah, and all my pictures, I think I had maybe about, maybe 8 paintings. They were all of real animals. There weren't any space monsters or even dragons or anything like that. Nothing Star Wars-y at all. They hired me to work on a video game actually via LucasArts, and that was The Dig, Steven Spielberg's The Dig, to design the creatures for that. They said that they hired me because they could tell I knew animal anatomy, and that's what they cared about. They didn't hire me because I had space monsters, but they hired me because I knew animal anatomy, and that was the first entertainment industry job that I had.
Cool. And what was it like working on a video game? Because again, like these days, the amount of detail, with 3D creatures and everything else, like it's definitely something where you can see all that detail. Whereas back then, obviously games are a little bit more crude, and so you got to kind of compensate a little bit for that. So I mean, for you to kind of translate what you had been studying, and obviously in such great depth, into something that's going to be kind of downsized into the game. What was that experience like, getting to be a part of that?
Well, it was first of all, it was very, 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 very fun. But what they had me do actually was to draw the animals as realistically as possible, because then that would allow them to edit down. And as you said, the technology was a relatively new technology back then, and so they just said, "Hey, no, make them as real as
no constraints."
No constraints, yeah. And let the anatomy sing, because then they said, well, we can edit it down. But give us more information give us as much information as possible.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
So I did.
So from there, like, what happened? Was that something that kind of sparked a longer relationship with LucasArts, or what happened after that project?
Well, after that project, I was hired by the licensing company for the World Wildlife Fund. That happened to be located in San Francisco. And so for the next year and a half, I was doing all kinds of wildlife designs, from anything from designing collectible figurines of wildlife to snow globes with wildlife in them, T-shirts, cookie jars, Christmas ornaments. I did lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pandas, as you can imagine. I'm very good at doing pandas, but all kinds of wildlife. And then about a year and a half after that gig, I got a call from Industrial Light and Magic, and because they needed someone who could do animals for Jumanji. So that was my first feature.
That is 1 or 2 animals in it, if I recall correctly.
Oh, yeah. 1.5 animals, yes.
Cool. I mean, that would have been a pretty amazing experience, because at the same time, obviously there's a lot of growth on that project. Especially all the research for for that movie. So I mean, what was that experience like?
It was quite wonderful, and my art director was Doug Chang.
Oh wow!
Yeah, who went on to art direct me on the Phantom Menace and such. But I had so that was a great project, and there was a lot of. I was very, very fortunate to be hired by ILM at the time, because it was really, really like the Wild West.
Yeah.
So many programs, technologies were being developed. The very first, decent fur programs, for example, fur software, all kinds of things. It was just amazingly crazy in the best of all possible worlds. I mean, it was like Tuesday was like explosion day. That's when up, don't go out over there, because that's, all the pyrotechnics are going on.
And that would have been near the Katurran soundstage back then, right, in San Rafael?
Absolutely. It was just amazing. So it was a great experience. And also, so during that time there at ILM, anything that had an animal in it or anything that had a creature in it, they just handed it to me. Wow. I think I was the only female artist working there at that point, which is fine.
How many people would have been there at the time?
How many people in the art department? Let's see. There was about maybe 7 artists, and some would come and go depending upon the job or the contract or whatever. So it was usually about 7 or 8 on average, and everybody had a particular specialty. I think Benton Jew was there, Tyrone Ellison was there, gosh, a number of Eric Tiemans was there. Obviously, I mentioned Doug. He was there, and sometimes Ian McKay would drift in and out, depending upon all that.
That's really cool. And I guess what would be some of the challenges that you would be facing around that time, like on project to project?
Gosh, well, obviously there's deadline. So we worked pretty long hours. We worked from about 7:30 in the morning to about 7:30 in the evening.
Wow.
On average. About 7 o'clock, the guys would start getting kind of punchy in a good way. They had all their computers all connected together, so then they'd play video games about 7 o'clock. It was pretty crazy, yeah. And I just had a great time. The art department was located right next to the model shop, so that was really cool.
Yeah.
So I worked on lots of, movies, commercials, lots of commercials. ILM did lots and lots of commercials. Yeah, so.
That's great. Like, what year would that have been in? Like 96 around then, or?
94.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, definitely a pretty interesting time. And I guess in terms of that, how long were you there for? During the time?
I was there at ILM for about 6 months, and then I was funneled directly into Lucasfilm for Star Wars.
Cool. That's great.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, did you learn a lot during that experience?
Golly, I sure did. I really, really did. To see movie making, to see TV making, because you're just there by osmosis observing all of this. All the teamwork, all the threads that have to be tapestried together to make these things work. And I worked on a lot of things that weren't greenlit too. That's the way it goes.
Yeah, I was just talking about that with someone yesterday, how frustrating it can be to have your proudest work that you love to death and no one ever gets to see it outside of,
Yeah, no. And then you have to get special permission even 5 years after the fact. Well, can I put this in my portfolio and all that? And still something I worked on. My goodness, it's almost 20 years ago. I still can't get permission to show any of that concept work.
That's tough.
Yeah, it's too bad. But, that's the way it is sometimes.
So you were saying from there you transitioned over to Lucasfilm?
Yeah. So
I guess you slowly worked through the entire, every single division of the Lucas Empire one by one.
Well, what had happened was, I was at ILM, and I was asked to do a reconstruction, because they didn't have very much of the dewback, one of the dewbacks there. I didn't, maybe it was like a test or something. So I did. I had 2 references, like a really fuzzy, tiny photograph of a dewback, the head of it, and then part of the head of a dewback, because things like, foam, latex and stuff tend to just disintegrate pretty quickly. So that's about all I had. And so I was asked to do a dewback. And so I did. And no explanation. And so I did. And then went back to the commercial I was working on, which was a honeycomb commercial.
a bit of a transition.
Yeah. And then about a week later, Mark Morris came by. He was one of my other art directors. And he said, this made a big hit at the ranch. And at first, naive as I was, I didn't quite put 2 and 2 together until I realized the ranch meant George Lucas. It's like the White House means the president. So
that's right.
And I think I was happy for the rest of my life at that point, just to hear that.
That's so great.
Yeah, and I think Dennis Mueller came by and said, "Hey, that's a good job." And I thought that was also made me happy for the rest of my life. Yeah,
he's such a nice guy.
He is. He absolutely is. Absolutely. And, I felt like a little kid on a totem pole, because I'd only been there for 6 months. So
that's cool. And what happened then?
Well, then it became official that George was going to be starting the Star Wars franchise up again. And so there was a nationwide call for everybody, whoever wants to work on Star Wars, to submit your portfolio. And of course, all of us at ILM, because you're not guaranteed just because you work at ILM that you get to work on Star Wars. We all submitted, well, many of us did our portfolios as well, and to see what happened. And then I went home about a couple of weeks. Oh, but no, that's been about a month or two after that. Doug Chang called me that evening, said that, guess what? You and I are going to be working on the next Star Wars. And we were so excited. Absolutely.
That's great.
Yeah. So it started, you were the first two hired, and he was the art director and I was the creature designer. And then every couple months after that, then George as things progressed, would hire a new artist. And so eventually there was about maybe 6 or 7 of us at any one time working on that film at the most. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ian was hired, Benji was hired, a number of other artists were hired, and it was quite exciting.
It's cool. And what were some of the challenges on that project? I mean, I know we'll get into it in a moment, but you obviously were responsible for some pretty memorable characters. So what was it like during that time?
Well, when we first were hired, George gave us tons and tons and tons of blue sky. Like, he gave us the context of the worlds, what the worlds were like, and then said, okay, design for him. And one of the challenges was there needed to be a design connection between these prequels and the episodes 4 through 6. I mean, it had to look like it was all kind of part of the same aesthetic sensibility, with allowances for different cultures on different worlds, like, things that took place on Tatooine still have to look like Tatooine.
Right.
But things that happened on Naboo, that was really cool because it was a very beautiful, beautiful, beautiful world with very, very involved ecosystems. And so my job, initially speaking, was to fill that world with species that looked like they belonged to it, like a whole natural history. And so for about the first 6 months, I was mainly working on just, let's say, the characters for the Stampede scene on Naboo. Mm-hmm. And then at that midway through that's when we started to work, say, on characters like the Gungans and Jar Jar and such, and so on and so forth. So that was what the first, at least 6 months, was kind of like just kind of exploring this universe. And it was a very unique thing because unlike a regular, say, 20th Century Fox or even Disney, George, the buck stopped with him and he was financing everything. So we had the luxury of being able to really take time and explore this world before
carte blanche.
Yeah, exactly. That is rare. I don't know if it's really ever happens.
It's extremely rare that, I mean, especially you fast forward to 2018, like it just doesn't happen at all. Yeah. But that's so great. And I guess in a way you're creating your own language in terms of creating these species and trying to make them all interconnect.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so cool. And in terms of the Gungans, Jar Jar, you had a lot of responsibility for creating him, or?
Yeah, I did. We all contributed to his design. I would say primarily Doug and Ian McCaig and myself. We worked a lot on him. I think Doug came up with kind of the essence of the direction as far as what his face was going to look like, but then was handed over to me to make it quote unquote real. Mm-hmm. With all the anatomy. And then Ian, he worked a lot on, Ian was the costume designer. Any costume, whether it be a humanoid character or an animal-ish character, all those costumes, that's Ian's work. I really didn't have anything to do with the costuming. But as far as Jar Jar's anatomy, how he walked, all what made him be able to do what he could do, even his teeth, his palate, his tongue, all of that was my job. His coloration, his skeleton, his muscle configuration, all of that, so that the riggers would be able to rig him, so that the modelers would be able to model him, so he'd be animatable. Mm. Yeah. So.
That's so cool. And what was it like kind of, obviously you're kind of giving life to him, creating all the mannerisms and giving him that personality. What was it like, seeing him come to life?
It's kind of like you have a child and your child graduates from college. I think it's like that. So that was the feeling. And I felt the same way with all the, any of the other characters that I developed, that to see them actually up there, it's just amazing. And then realizing that how many, many, many people it took to get them up there.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't just me. It was the whole like the force of industrial light and magic making that possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's also such a pivotal point in time too. I mean, it's the first, technically the first ever CG character, main character in a story. So obviously, it has very mixed reception from everyone in the world, but I think that's more to do with how he talks and how he's been scripted to be in the film. But at the same time, it's made him memorable to the entire world, to history.
Well, I did my best on him. My private joke is actually he sounds just like Jeremy Irons, but he was out of work, needed the job, and so he did what a Gungan had to do to provide for his family. But
that's right.
But it was quite fun, and then there are so many other characters like doing like Sebulba, who I call the anti-Jar Jar. He's just so mean and awful.
He's great.
I love him, and I think my favorite one of all of them is the Sando Aqua Monster. I really loved working on that character.
So which one was that? I'm very familiar with Sebulba because it's just such a for me, like I got into 3D in the very early 90s, and a couple of friends of mine had kind of taken it on themselves to kind of remodel and recreate Sebulba, which I thought was just for it being such a complicated or complex character, the horse kind of like character, it's definitely like an interesting one to look at. But with the other one though, like which one's that?
Monster. Well, when they go into the abyss in the middle of the planet, it's all the water. It's basically the story of big fish eating little fish.
Yeah, I was gonna say always a bigger fish.
Big fish is the Sando Aqua Monster, the big dragon, underwater dragon. That's my favorite one.
That's great. That's really cool.
Everything.
And let's say Sebulba or that one or Jar Jar. I mean, where do you typically look for a lot of your reference?
In nature, just in the real world. And the key to Star Wars design really is it's just planet Earth slightly tweaked. So that's why people believe that they can imagine themselves there in that universe. So with Jar Jar, he was like a combination of, hadrosaur dinosaur and parrotfish pattern on his skin, and obviously amphibian, and emu, the way he walked. With Sebulba, his influence came from a dromedary camel at the Oakland Zoo. If you look at his head, it's a camel head.
Right. So, okay. Yeah. You're right. I totally thought horse all this time, but you're right. Like now, I totally get it.
Yeah. So a camel is a very large, very grand, arrogant-looking animal. It's a very elegant in its very strange way. And so to miniaturize it in a way and make it ridiculous, I think I wanted a camel's kind of sour attitude to translate into Sebulba, and then so I think hopefully that did.
Yeah. No, it works. It totally works. Because again, like, I think, there's always going to be there's so many characters, but there's always going to be a couple that have like a lot of attitude or whatever it is that really resonates with the audience. And he's definitely one of them. And, when you think of Star Wars, especially Phantom Menace, you're always going to think of the pod racing, which is such a big part of it. So, yeah, I mean, that's really cool. And, yeah, I mean, from there, obviously, having gotten to work on, such a pivotal project, I mean, what were some of the transitions from there? Obviously, you've worked at Pixar and a lot of other Disney a lot as well. Like from there, what were some of the big pivotal points in your career?
From Star Wars, I went to Disney, and I worked on Brother Bear, and that was out of Orlando. So they would fly me down to Orlando for a couple of weeks, and then they'd fly me back home, which was back to Oregon, basically. And so it's kind of cool, like being able to work in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and hey, let's go to Florida and then go back again. That was really cool because I'm half Floridian. My father was native Floridian, so I thought that was kind of cool.
Cool.
Yeah. So I love working on Brother Bear. That was my most favorite projects because you really got to do a lot of real animals. So my job initially was to do a lot of realistic studies of bears and anatomy studies of them in all kinds of poses for the animators to have reference from. And then from there to edit down from the actual bear down to, let's say, the very close to the studio release character. So it's before I was designing for 3D, and now I was designing for 2D. It's not that dissimilar, but with 2D animation, it's, again, giving the production team as much information as possible is very, very important. And then you can edit what you need to do for 2D. Otherwise, you obviously can't draw every single hair and back because there'd be the never-ending movie. But you have to have, the anatomy needs to be spot on, especially for a naturalistic production. So Brother Bear is very similar in many ways to Bambi as far as aesthetics go, perhaps even more so.
Right.
And it was art directed. My supervisor was Aaron Blaze, and to this day we're very good friends. And yeah, that was a wonderful production to be on. And then, ironically, those same production drawings were then used for Brave for reference as well.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so that was kind of neat. Yeah.
Cool. No, I love that. And like, how do you, like, I guess looking at reality or comparing 3D, but how do you think the final perception of a 2D character, how translates over, like what are the big differences you find? Because obviously, especially with Disney, you gotta do the big eyes and make it cute and cuddly, assuming that it is one of the more favorable characters. But typically, like, what do you find are the big differences between, let's say, reality and more of the Disney style characters?
I would say that if we're talking about, it depends upon the production. Like, there's a world of difference. It's apples and oranges. I mean, they're both very high quality, lovely productions. There's Zootopia, which is not very intentionally non-realistic animals, and then you'd have Brother Bear, which is realistic animals but in a 2D setting. And then let's see, probably a better comparison would be Brother Bear, and then say Lilo and Stitch.
Right.
So you've got a whole lot of, and I did not work on that one, but you've got a whole lot with Lilo and Stitch. You have a whole lot of intentionally exaggerated characters, even with real species that do occur in Lilo and Stitch, like the little frog, for example. There's a lot of aesthetic exaggeration. Brother Bear was pretty conservative when it comes to that. But with Brother Bear, there was a very, very hypersensitivity to the way animals moved, the way they ran, all of that. Obviously, animals, don't, talk in English, but it wasn't that different designing for Brother Bear as for 3D. Really, it's you want to get a point across. You want to have natural movement. In a way, 2D animation self-corrects problems that are challenges for 3D animation. There's an intuitive feel when an animator is drawing these cells, because an animator basically is an illustrator just drawing the same character in slightly different poses all over, that where a 2D animated drawing gives a real intuitive sense of weight and gravity.
Right.
And they're still trying to work out the bugs on that in 3D.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. And it's such a huge challenge. I mean, and that's the thing too, is that when you talk about 3D, unless it is more a Pixar style, like more stylized, then, mimicking reality, it's such a huge transition. I was just interviewing one of the people responsible for Paul Walker in Furious 7 the other day at Weta Digital in New Zealand, and that's where they're replacing an actor who's passed away, and they're trying to do it in a way that it's not obvious to the audience, like, you know, what shots are real and what aren't, because halfway through he passed away. And so the fact that they're going to the point where different mannerisms or facial expressions are going to draw, you know, pump blood into different parts of the face, and just the level of detail that we're always striving to perfect. And
the challenge of not resulting in, you know, various uncanny valleys. That's a big one.
That's right. You want an actor, not Pinocchio, you know. But that's just it. And but that's the thing with you know, getting to do characters that people aren't necessarily familiar with, is where you get, again, carte blanche in a completely different way. You get that freedom to be able to create something new and fresh, where people aren't judging it. They're instead getting to receive it or perceive it.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge with 3D is, as far as creatures go, it's far more difficult to do convincingly to do a real species than it is to do an imaginary species.
Right.
Because the imaginary species has no peers in nature, but you're always going to be able to tell the difference between, well, at least right now, you're going to be able to tell the difference between a CG horse and a real horse. You can spot that, at least I can.
I feel like you've got a different relationship with horses, that you're a lot more familiar than I might be.
Let's take another example. Let's say an elephant. There we go.
Sure. Again, I think I've been about 10 feet from one once. But yeah, no, I totally get that. And I was just curious too, like from there, obviously working on such a big iconic film, like what was the, and you know, Brother Bear was amazing. I really loved that film. It was probably one of the last 2D films I've seen in quite a while, but I was really fond of it. And yeah, I mean, from there, like, did you stay at Disney for quite a while, or what was the next step?
The next step after that, that was interesting. I worked for a variety of different studios, doing, it kind of becomes a blur, doing all manner of characters. Some are very exaggerated, almost, you know, cartoony characters, to more realistic ones. But I had the opportunity to actually initiate my own IP, which was a story called the Katurran Odyssey, and which is going to be republished late this year. So I'm really happy about that. It's a book. It was a very experimental book at the time. It was sort of a mixture between, it wasn't a graphic novel, but it wasn't your typical storybook. It was more, for lack of a better purpose, a cinematic novel. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
It was done in basically a film aspect ratio. Mm-hmm. So that when you open up the book, it has the same proportions as your cinema film, and you know there's text and type, but yet most of the real estate is illustrations, and it's a fantasy story about a lemur. He lives on a planet that's like Earth, but it's not the Earth. It's a planet called Katurran, and it's inhabited entirely by animals. And prehistoric animals. Any animal or any species that lived on this planet lives on Katurran. And it's a story of an adventure that he goes on, of exile and redemption and all of that. And so that is what I worked on for, a couple of years. I was able to do that. So, yeah. I think.
What was it like, though, getting to, take a break from some of the other more collaborative projects and get to do something that you can really invest all the experience that you've had so far into doing something new and unique for yourself?
It was very lovely and very refreshing, and I would encourage any artist to think about doing that, because it's to have something where you're not just running from job to job to job, but and those jobs all belong to somebody else, but this is something that belongs to you is pretty magical. And it wasn't totally uncollaborative either, because I not only worked with an editor, but also with a very wonderful designer and storyteller, Robert Gould, who co-owns that property with me. And so it was it was a very wonderful experience. David Weger, who is a screenwriter, he took my prose and put it into a really nice prose. So it was still a collaborative project, and to be able to reprise that project this year is with all those people is pretty darn cool. So I feel really, really fortunate.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's so awesome. And just to jump around a little bit, but to talk about Brave, so you went to Pixar for a little bit. Like, what was it like? Let's say, at least back then, because everything's now owned by Disney, whether you're Lucas or anywhere. But yeah, what was it like going from, let's say, Disney to Pixar, and like in terms of the projects, the experience, and the environment as well?
Well, I worked on Brave early on. It wasn't for all that long a time. But what it was is that with Pixar, as opposed to, well, it's that particular production, but I would say in general for Pixar, as opposed to, say, the more traditional Disney work, is that the look and feel of Pixar is different. It is all about a design aesthetic, and the design aesthetic, of course, is tailored somewhat to the particular production. Brave is a very elegant, very, very elegant aesthetic, especially with Eleanor the bear. It's very Celtic, sensitive to let's say, a mythical Scotland. And all of that relates to how that film feels. I'm working on Eleanor. At first, she had almost a wasp waistness to herself. And eventually then she got more bear-like proportions, but there was still that very elegant feel to her.
Right.
So everything it was almost like working on an illustrated book as opposed to, say, traditional Disney or film aesthetic. That was my experience. Yeah.
That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah, actually, one of my favorite paintings at Pixar at the studio is I forget how big it is now, because in my mind it's like 20 feet tall, but I'm pretty sure it's not that big. But yeah, it's like they've got a gigantic Brave painting, like paint-like, frame of the movie. And yeah, like, again, it's one of those things that always stands out when I think of Pixar. It's always like that particular picture of all of the ones there. But yeah, that's cool. Like, was that the only project there, or that
was my only project for Pixar.
That's cool. That's really cool. And at the same time, like, John Carter, like, what was that experience like? Because again, it's a Disney project, but a really amazing and iconic one.
That was fun. Actually, it was Ian McCaig who art directed me on that one.
I like that film.
Yeah, it is. It's a fun film. Lots of cool aliens and such, and it was kind of. It's not meant to be sci-fi. I mean, it's Edgar Rice Burroughs, and totally, we know that the true Martian landscape would not be able to sustain life, at least not to that kind of life.
Or having creatures running 1,000 miles an hour, but yeah.
Yeah. But it was really, really fun working on them, especially the various beasts and such, and that was a fun romp.
I really like that film because I knew nothing about it. I didn't actually realize that it was one of those like giant cash cows that didn't really get the reception they were expecting at the box office. But for me, like, I think they put out like some teaser of 10 minutes or 5 minutes of the film, and it was, I think, in the arena. And I don't know, for whatever reason, it just kind of really resonated with me. It reminded me of more, a lot of older movies that I watched as a kid that would have been more, 60s, 70s.
It reminded me of Ray Harryhausen movies.
Exactly, yeah. It just kind of had more of that classic feel rather than, a lot of the movies that were coming out at the time. So that's what really intrigued me about it. And that's really cool. And what were some of the creatures you were involved with in that? And what were some of the big challenges involved in it too?
I would say the major ones. Gosh, what's really sad is I can't hardly remember. I'm going to have to describe them because I can't quite remember the names.
That's the problem when you've worked on so many things.
I know, it's all a blur. It's really, really, really sad. I'm not really going senile, but there's just so many things. What is the really cute one? It's like a little pug.
Yeah.
That one, I worked on him. I really like working on him. And then the horse-like ones. I like working on those a lot. And then, of course, there was the main Martian ones, which were interesting. My job was to kind of figure out their anatomy and how does like this two-armed, two-legged, two pairs of arms, one pair of legs, where does the heart fit? Where does the lungs fit? I mean, not that the audience saw that, but,
it's cool you had that attention to detail.
Yeah. So that was kind of cool. It was just, of course, working with Ian's always great. So it was fun.
That's great.
Yeah.
And what about Beowulf?
Yeah.
Don't say that you did the horses or something, because I know that Zemeckis, because his wife, she's obsessed with horses, so it's always like any Bob Zemeckis film has always got horses involved as much as possible, and crucifixes are always just like two things that he puts in everything.
Well, I actually worked on the dragon is what I worked on.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, the anatomy of the dragon, the orthographics of the dragon. Yes, that's what my job was on that project. It was fun. I had a good time.
Yeah, I popped by Sony a lot during that time, and yeah, it's kind of fun just kind of seeing the whole movie come together, because it was such a big project to to take on, and just kind of seeing like the early stages of it and bit by bit as it all progressed. And again, as another one that's like iconic as being a very high caliber CG animated feature at the time that was aiming for kind of hyper realism. It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And the fun thing, of course, is everybody you work with. That's always a really wonderful benefit, is the people you meet in the process. Every project is an adventure.
Yeah, I love it. And like, I guess like for you, what have been some of the more recent challenges on projects that you've run into? I mean, obviously, in some ways, nothing changes. You're kind of going through the same process, but at the same time, I think the demands are always going to be different. So like for you, what do you find are some of the more challenging projects that you've come across, or specifically the tasks that you've had to take on?
Let's see. Some I can only vaguely mention because quite a few of them are under NDA. Let's see if I can think of several ones are under NDA. Oh, well, let's see. I recently worked on a film. I think it's safe for me to say it's one of the greatest American novels. And it's an animal story.
You're giving me hints. I've got to go and like get a magnifying glass and follow the clues.
Yeah, I recently worked on this particular film, and the challenge is so that the particular animal, the hero animal, needs to be very believable, but it needs to be very personable. So it's a character, it needs to be believable. So we're doing not quite hyper realism. So that was a challenge. What is that sweet spot? And so that was a challenge there. And a lot of what I'm asked to do, they're asking me not so much to come up with a fully, rendered, totally realistic character, because there's texture artists and such to do that, but they want me to kind of nail the essence of the character. Mm-hmm. And so that's a lot of what I do, the proportions, the anatomy, the expressions, making sure that all works. And then somebody else, can do the texture and all that sort of thing, and then go on to the next thing. So that's what I'm finding that I'm doing lately. It depends, though. I mean, like one of my recent jobs was with Electronic Arts. Another project I can't tell you what it is. Suffice to say that it had lots of both real animals and imaginary animals that were the result of the real animals. And so they already had designed the human characters. And so I had to make sure that these animals matched the aesthetic of the human characters. And these characters were exaggerated characters. They weren't photorealistic characters. So I had to put my Disney hat back on and design to fit that aesthetic, which is always fun too. So again, it's been a nice balance going from hyper realism to not realistic at all, but still things have to work, and they have to be, the essence is everything has to be animatable. animatable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. No, that's great. That's really cool. And I guess just like one or two more questions, but what do you think is, and I'm not talking about photorealism in the sense of like 3D and everything else, but like what do you think are some of the main characteristics that you always find like really gives life to your characters? Like are there typically, I mean, eyes are obviously going to be a key part, but do you think that there's certain characteristics that you always find like the implementation into characters is what really brings them to life?
Yeah, well, the eyes obviously are the windows of the soul, so those are very important because in any animal, I'm looking there at my greyhound Josette, who is, well, her eyes are closed right now because she's sleeping, which is her superpower. The eyes are very expressive, but gesture in animals is just as important. So how an animal looks at you, how it moves its body, cocks its head, and a lot of these are species specific, but yet at the same time, these are still gestures that animals use to communicate not just with their own species, but especially in the case with domestic animals, with us. Or animals can also communicate between different species as well. It's very, which is always very, very interesting. So what are the characteristic ways an animal walks, moves, behaves? What is their psychology? So you're looking beyond what the animal just looks like, but how it behaves. What is its personality? What is its soul? And you only learn that you learn it over and over again because it never ends, by getting out and watching the real deal, as much as you can. Obviously, we can't always go to New Guinea and look at, bird of paradise in the wild, but as much as possible to go to the zoo, to go to the pet store. Anybody can go to Petco and look at little animals, little budgies and mice and things behave. Your own animals, dogs, goldfish, whatever, is really going out and watching them. And so many people don't do that. I don't understand it. So.
Yeah, no, it's going to make me pay a bit more attention, I think. So, yeah, I love it. No, this has been so cool. And yeah, again, I just want to thank you for taking the time to chat. I mean, this has been really cool. Where can people go to find out more about you or to purchase your books and other things like that?
Well, to purchase my books, they can go to designstudiopress.com. And if people want to see my artwork, I have my portfolio is on an ArtStation, artstation.com/Terryl Whitlatch. And you can see my stuff there, and then of course my books are readily available at Design Studio Press, or of course Amazon. But I'll give a shout out to Design Studio Press.
That's right. Go to the source.
Yeah.
No, that's super cool. And yeah, obviously I'll link to all your links in the show notes too. I think that'll be really cool. But again, this has been really inspiring and a lot of fun to chat.
Oh, it's my honor and pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I want to thank Terryl for taking the time out to chat. I had a blast with this episode, and I hope you got a lot from it. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to be back next week. In the meantime, if you haven't gotten the Ultimate Demo Reel Guide, I'm going to mention it again. Go to alanmckay.com/myreel. And again, the show notes with everything that we discussed, all the key quotes and insights and everything else is available at alanmckay.com/159. So that being said, I'll be back next week. Until then, rock on.